There we go. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Ryan O'Connor. So I am working with RDA Europe. I am working on the RDA TIGER project, which is hosting this webinar series. I'll give you a little bit of detail on what the TIGER project has done and is doing just before I hand over to some of the presenters. So we're recording the session here today, and the session will be focusing on repositories, trustworthiness, and certification, and all things associated with that. So just a brief run through the agenda. So as I said, now I'll just give you a few minutes of an introduction to what we're doing, what we're covering, a bit of background on the RDA TIGER project and what kind of motivated us to host this webinar series. And then I'll hand over to our presentation. So we'll have 4 presentations today. The first will be from Dawei Lin, who is one of the co-chairs of the WDS RDA Trust Principles Outreach and Adoption Working Group. I'll hand over then to Mickey Lindler and to Bertrand Caron from the EOSC EDEN project. I'll then hand over to Hervé Lours and Oliver Parks, who are representing the FIDELIS project. And then finally to Wim Hugo and to Lauren Maxwell, who are on the very long named working group, which has been shortened to the acronym the TRSPs working group. As I said, we have 90 minutes for the session, so each of these presentations will be about hopefully about 15 minutes long. I'll try and keep on top of the time. So we've roughly about half an hour towards the end for Q&A. We were just discussing this. I think if you have any questions through the presentation, please feel free to add them to the chat. Our presenters will be happy to answer them there. If you've maybe at the end of each presentation, we'll have a minute or two if there's any sort of clarification questions or anything like that. But if you have kind of more substantive questions, please hold them to the end. We'll have plenty of room for discussion, or feel free to add them to the chat. So just a bit of background quickly on the RDA TIGER project for those of you who aren't aware of it or who haven't had any encounters with it before. So essentially this project is a project that's been running for the last 3 years, and it's actually wrapping up now at the end of December this year. So we're in the very, very, very final stretches. So essentially what we've been doing for the last 3 years is providing support to RDA working groups in various different ways. So we've been providing sort of in-kind support and various different sort of support services that we've put in place, including facilitation, communications, and landscape engagement services. We've also been providing some financial support to the community, either via these external engagement of external experts grants, which are kind of smaller grants than these larger cascading grants. We've also developed the RDA knowledge base. So that is essentially kind of a suite of tools to allow sort of annotation and improve the findability and searchability basically of RDA, of all RDA documentation and related RDA outputs. The project has been run by 4 partner consortium, so ourselves at RDA Europe, along with CoData based in France, DANCE in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands eScience Centre. So just some numbers, just some kind of very top level numbers that won't really go into here, but just a few things that we've kind of completed essentially in the last 3 years. We've supported 20 groups via the facilitation service and a lot of other groups via other means, helped 13 new groups get off the ground, and we've provided different travel grants and grants for adoption of different outputs as well. So a bit of background just on that. So what we've been doing, yes, is, as I explained there, is we've been helping groups sort of internally within RDA and to improve and professionalize these internal services and their operations. But another aspect of the TIGER project was to improve the impact of the work that RDA groups are doing. So obviously we're funded by the European Commission, so we're very much going to focus on the European landscape. But along with that, we are sort of aware, and we do adhere to one of the principles of RDA groups is to have that global aspect as well, which we'll touch on later in the presentations. So one of the things we've been doing over the last 6 months now is a very kind of large scale landscape analysis of the value of RDA outputs, so working group and some interest group outputs to the EOSC ecosystem in general. We've been looking at various aspects of the European landscape and the EOSC ecosystem to do with the Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda, or the SRIA, the EOSC-related Horizon Europe projects and national research infrastructures and national strategies, and we've done a kind of very large scale mapping of the RDA working group and interest group activities and outputs and their value to these. That report is in the kind of final stages of publication. We'll be completing it before the end of the year, and we'll be doing a lot of promotion outreach with that before the end of the year and also into next year as well. So that just kind of puts in a bit of context of what we're doing. Generally with this cross-fertilisation webinar series, we want to get discussions going on how we can foster that impact of RDA working group outputs on the European ecosystem. So this specific session today will focus on, as I said, the repository certification environment in general. We'll also be looking at kind of repository services and features and their functions, and the relationship between existing frameworks and principles and how these kind of map onto each other, and what extra work can be sort of gleaned from those relationships and mapping. Just as a quote here, I've taken from the SRIA that I think just kind of puts it into context again, just kind of linking back to that aspect of what the Tiger project has to do in terms of mapping out and advocating for the impact of RDA working groups on the European on the EOSC environment. So there's a quote here: "The EOSC as a sustainable collaboration system aims to link research data repositories and interconnect services and infrastructures." So obviously each one of the words in that sentence has can have a lot of different interpretations. So that's a kind of pretty loaded statement, but I think that's something that these working groups that we'll be focusing on today and the two projects as well are working towards. So yeah, for really the intended outcomes for today is just to start that knowledge exchange and knowledge sharing between active RDA groups and other active projects, and just who are all sort of working on these overlapping kind of shared concerns. And just kind of further down the line as well, we really want to encourage the adoption of RDA outputs and the kind of further alignment of RDA work with ongoing initiatives. Just as so as I said, now this is actually the fifth of the cross-fertilisation webinars we've held. We held 3 last year on the topics of semantic interoperability, metadata standards, and fair, care, and trust adoption. We also held one this time last week on making mappings fair with a couple of RDA groups who were supporting with the Tiger project. The recordings of all of these are on the RDA YouTube channel. You can scan the QR code there and it'll take you to the right place. I think that is it. Yeah, so that is it from my side of things. As I said, I'll hand over to my colleague Dawei now. But if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to. We'll maybe have a minute or two at the end of each presentation for clarification questions. But if you have something more substantive, please hold it to the end, or please feel free to share it in the chat. Dawei, I'll control the slides for your presentation. So over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan and Lisa, to put this webinar together. And I just start by saying I really want to thank the Tiger team. And I think you did more than what the missions like Ryan just described. I think you also have a lot of insightful input to the working group, and we feel like you're part of our working group as well. So I'm sure like other working group probably feel the same. So yeah, thanks for that. So I will give an overview of the trust principles and then we learned that running the working groups to continue outreach and help adoption of the trust principles. And I think one theme came out of that working group is the trust principle can be used as a common reference to align other trustworthy operations and services. And next slide. And so the open science is very important, but also face challenges. I think first one is the data is losing in real time and in the form of just losing data, not put into repositories, and also like the repository is despairing, as well as journals. So there is 3 reference in the bottom. You can read details. And another aspect is that there is other principles that help the data ecosystem, and they together with the some new requirement from users like the AI ready data sets really need a long-term surveys. For example, the AlphaGo, AlphaFold, the project who won the Nobel Prize, it takes 50 years to utilize the protein data, protein structure data. So that's kind of how long we can see the value of the data. And, uh, and the repository certification is a tool to help improve the operation of the repository, but often is considered too complex, too much work, and not for us for many reasons. And next slide. So that's uh, the motivation or the background to develop the trust principles is going to make it easy to understand why data repository is important, and also develop a concise and measurable metrics to help a repository improve their trustworthiness. And trust is not a new standard or criteria or best practices. It's just a high level communication point to advocate the importance of other platform of approaches to increase the trustworthiness of operations and services. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of the trust principles, and the transparency is about the specific repository services and data holdings, and the responsibility is to ensuring the authenticity and integrity of data holdings and the good services, and user focus is to really satisfy the evolving need of the users, and sustainability is to keep those services long term, and technology is to have the sufficient infrastructure to support operations. Next slide. And so the trust principle is developed under RDA and has a lot of contributors, and it's not surprising is start accepted by a lot of those stakeholders. And on the slide, there is now like 73 endorsements so far, a lot of from the FIDELIS repositories, and the publication for trust principles is still probably receive one access per day and one citation per week. And so there is a lot of interest, but it's still we are interested to see how people can use the trust principles for some practical applications. Next slide. And that's the goal for the working group, that we want to understand like what are the hindrances that to prevent trust adoption, and then how we can connect with the specific implementations, and how do we improve the understandability and usability of trust. So, and then the clarify the relationship between other principles and other certification frameworks, because there is a lot of confusion for that. And next slide. And so for the last, I think, year and a half, we did a lot of outreach, and this is coming from a survey from more than 100 repositories. And so we ask open questions, like say, what do they think about trust principles? Like not in the paper languages, is in their own language. And so this is the top three for each of the letters. And if you compare those things with the papers, actually it was pretty, still have a pretty good alignment. And people use different languages. For example, the in trustworthy column, the first one is general documentation. And that is not mentioned in the paper, but I think it does have some the paper does have like the like preservation time, like have to disclose to users, and that was not mentioned by the user, which is kind of interesting. And then I just mentioned another example, like for sustainability. The first one is policy, uh, but mainly I think that refers to the policy of the plans. Like what is the sustainability policy? What is the continuity policy plans? So that's I think it's kind of uh, um, still kind of consistent with the paper originally proposed, but does have the different terminologies. So that's kind of the things probably the working group will adjust, like to use the language that the people understand to promote the trust principles. And next slide. And this is uh, the quotes from uh, the working group use cases. So we invite the standards, the principles, and repositories to give a longer narrative of what they think about trust principles. How do they use it? If they have any difficulties, and then this is the some highlight from the those use case statements that we have it, I think, available publicly. Probably will kind of summarize that when we generate the final report. So the first like is really from the cultural seal as a standard, and the most I think the assessment is that the culture seal requirements map many times to different principles, but there were some details is not mentioned in the trust principle paper, either the five principles or the sub principles. As you can see, that those are kind of details, which is kind of reasonable to expect that the trust principle may not be that operate at that level. And for care principles, is that there is a lot of overlap, but the definitely the cares is uh, is more I think put focus on the indigenous data and sovereignty, all that component. So there is a kind of complementary between the principles. And for Eden project is as mentioned that the trust is currently used in the theoretical level, but maybe it's more visible as the project progress. And then for the individual repositories, the Australian Neural Cloud from University of Salzburg is a new repository. Is So they mentioned that it's kind of helpful to keep trust principle in mind, but the culture seal gave more details that they can indirectly fulfill many of the trust principle elements. And then digital repository of Ireland is a pretty mature repository, and and then they use trust principle as a self-reflection and an opportunity to engage with other members and also help their strategic plan development. And then TIB Digital Long-Term Archive is also mentioned the way to fulfill trust principle by implementing the different the repository standard. And next slide. So I think the point to add up is that in order for people to really maximize the value of data, you need the whole ecosystem work together. And I think from this Nature scientific data paper is that the different principles operate at different level at the fair at data. Trust is at the repository or resource level, and then the care is at the community level. And on the left uh, bottom, I think is about the quality and usability of data. and the long-term integrity and authenticity, and also the broad benefits. Next slide. So this is more like a speculation, since like the so we talk first, and I think there are some connections between trust and other efforts that which is probably going to present later. And like for Eden projects, maybe trust can have a baseline for service quality, governance, maturity, and across institutional interoperability. And then for Fidelis, which is also a important effort, maybe can support cross repository assurance federations and shared expectation of trustworthiness, because you kind of try to coordinate with a network of trustworthy repositories. And for the trustworthy service providers working group, maybe that can be focus on like trust is principle at the high level, but the working group can do more practical criteria, indicator of maturity path, and to operationalize the trust across infrastructures. And I think probably that one more slide, just the information that we continue to working on the working group goals, and feel free to join us. And there are some publications there, and and then some contact information.
Great. Thank you, Dawei. Thank you, first of all, for keeping to time, which is very helpful. No, that was really interesting. It was a really good overview of what the group is doing, and those potential sort of uh, overlaps you described there at the end was really helpful. We do maybe, as I said earlier, we have a minute or so. Maybe is there any kind of clarifying questions in the chat? I'll have a quick look. Nothing that I can see so far. I mean, I'll give people an opportunity maybe just to open their microphones if they have any sort of very quick questions that they want to ask. Lauren, please go ahead.
Great. That was a fantastic presentation, Dawi. So in the paper that you mentioned, the why and how the trust principles for data repositories are used, how did you identify the repositories for the survey? And just briefly, how do you think that might have affected your findings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we actually the Tiger Group help a lot. Like for the all the RDA list, they can probably blast that and to see if they can reach out as much as they can. And then we also kind of from our working group is from also from pretty diverse background, from like social science, biomedical science, the other things. Uh, I think it still probably need more coverage to get really generalizable findings. But so far, I think we have 100, as I mentioned, like the repositories.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so I think the idea is like we get this finding first, and probably we're gonna release the report and have further comments. So hopefully we can get additional perspectives.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren, for the question. Thanks again, Dawei, for that. Really, really interesting. Really kind of sets us up, I think. Mickey, you are next. I can hand over to you.
Yep. Second. So you should be seeing my screen now. Let me
Yep,
get
all good.
organized here. Perfect. Second. Okay, cool. All right. So thank you very much. My name is Mickey Littlar. I lead the digital preservation team at TIB, Leibniz Information Center for Science and Technology, and within EOSC EDEN, I lead Work Package 1. Bertrand Caron is also involved in Work Package 1, works at TIB, and is responsible for the task that authored the core preservation process. So just to briefly give 1 minute or a very short background, as you saw in the vice presentation, TIB, the institution that I work for, wholeheartedly embraces certification. We also support the trust principles, but in some ways the core preservation processes are something that describes something that is 3 steps before all of that. Well, 3 steps before certification, most certainly. And I hope that by the end of the presentation, you will understand why we feel that it's necessary to define that and why that was missing until recently. So just 2 sentences or 2 short slides about EOSC EDEN in case you're not aware. Just 2 things I want to point out. First thing is you may be aware of EOSC EDEN, but not what the acronym stands for. It stands for Enhancing Digital Preservation Strategies at the European and national level. So very clearly, and this is what it differentiates it from FIDELIS, which is more looking at the repository sides of things. This is looking at digital preservation only. So it's a very digital preservation heavy project. And it started in January. The second slide is this one, and what I want to highlight here is that like Divide described about the trust working group, the same thing is true for EOSC EDEN, that the consortium is very diverse with the background that people bring to the table. There's institutions who do digital preservation for their own data or who do digital preservation as a service for others. There's software providers in there. There's also data holding institutions in there who come from different disciplines. So there really is a wide background represented in the project. So let's actually dive into what this presentation is about, though. Much of what we do in EOSC EDEN is tailored around what we call the reuse fitness model, or RUFIT for short. So the idea of that is, Devi said that data needs to be preserved and needs to be stored. One of the things that was mentioned in the call for this project is that there's a need for a model that helps you select, identify, and appraise what objects actually need to be or are a candidate for long-term archiving or long-term preservation, and not to just do that initially upon a first ingest, but as we all know, data volume capacity is limited, costs rise, there's a need for reappraisal at fixed point in times as well. So that said model should be reusable at that point in time as well. So we thought, okay, what is relevant when we think about data? One thing is that you can break down data into 3 different quality pillars. One is the contextual data quality, so the worth of what is actually described within the data. Is it something that's reproducible? Is it something that is of scientific value and so forth? The second one is the technical data quality, so how solid is the encoding? Is it a file format that you find suitable? Can you extract technical metadata? And the third one is about metadata quality, so more the descriptive side of things that you need to make sense of the object. And those 3 pillars don't just exist generally in the same scale for everyone, but they need to be measured against 2 things. The most important measure is that of the preservation objective and the designated community needs. So whatever you decide about this quality needs to match the reuse scenario, which is the preservation objective. What do my future users want to achieve that information? And the designated community needs. So what is the knowledge that I can assume about my future users? What kind of domain am I preserving this for? And the other bar it needs to meet is the trustworthy digital archive capabilities. So what can the archive that I give my data to, are they even able to handle these data quality criteria that I defined for the data? So that is the reuse fitness framework in short. It codifies good practice. Much of things that I just stated are already present in very many different frameworks that exist, but they haven't been pulled together in a concise manner. Like I said, it's supposed to provide a framework to support both curation preservation process, but it's also supposed to narrow the knowledge gap across different disciplines. It's supposed to give something that we can all use, but each discipline or each archive has to flesh this out according to their needs. Like I just said, it depends on the preservation objective, designated community, and the archival capabilities. There's also a few things that this is not. Its certification is in the title of this webinar, but neither the reuse fitness model nor the core preservation process, which I go into in a minute, are intended as a maturity model or a certification tool. There's many great tools out there that do that. This is not it. We didn't want to just do something else that has been done, but we link out to the certification frameworks. I'll show how in a minute. And neither the reuse fitness framework nor the core preservation processes cover everything a repository needs to do. Like I mentioned in my first slide when I introduced EOSC EDEN, they focus on digital preservation, but they will link to the TRAM matrix, and I'm sure that Hervé will show you in amazing detail how that works out. So let's look at the bottom bar, which is the core preservation processes that are in the title of the slide. So here we ask ourselves, what processes does a trustworthy digital archive need to include, right, to support those quality pillars and meet my preservation objective and designated community needs? So for that, we need a definition. What do we mean by core preservation process, right? Is it just everything? No, we wanted to be very precise and narrow down to what is relevant to digital preservation. So we define core preservation processes as a specific action that every trustworthy digital archive, which can be something that is included in a trustworthy digital repository, but doesn't have to be. So every trustworthy digital archive as a role has to undertake it, and the archive can undertake it either directly or they can use it as an associated service, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot about in today's last presentation. So it'll all kind of fit together in a nice storyline. The core preservation process focus on operational activities required by digital preservation, and they're limited to generic process. So there's a couple of warnings with that. So this means clearly that strategical and managerial activities like staffing or secure IT infrastructure management, much of what we find in certification frameworks are out of scope. That is not included in core preservation processes per design. Also, it means that the core preservation process will have to be supplemented by information. Not everything that you want to achieve, you'll be able to find in the core preservation descriptions by yourself. You need to use things that are relevant to your discipline or relevant to your institution, like your collection policy, for example. Right? Okay, so the origin story. Every good superhero needs an origin story. We took different frameworks into consideration, used them, extracted criteria that they require or that they describe as being a required process based on the definition you just saw for preservation. On the left, you see the long list. There's some candidates that are not surprising and well-fitting to this webinar, like the trust framework and also the three digital preservation certification frameworks, ISO 16363, Core Trust Seal, and Nestor Seal, but also a few other ones. And parent B was a large influential piece. It's the procurement toolkit publication of the Digital Preservation Coalition from 2022, kind of a description document that is supposed to help you in a procurement or tender process to help you understand what it is that a digital preservation system needs to do. So if you're probably familiar with all the frameworks or most of the frameworks on the left. Devi just introduced us to trust. So let's take an example from parent B, where if for something as easy as file format identification, standard process, and digital preservation, it only says the system must identify file formats to the level of specific file format version and reference appropriate registries of further information such as pronom and or Wikidata. If we go down to the certification frameworks, ISO 16363 has it in similar level of detail. Core Trust Seal and Nestor Seal have it a bit spread out through different requirements. But all of those just prescribe things, but they don't describe things. This helps you to understand what it is that you need to do, but it doesn't really tell you how. And that's the problem. So we extracted all these things and arrived at these 30 candidates, 30 things that you need to do as a digital preservation system, and file format identification is here in CPP 008. So we ended up pulling all this information together. This is the screen that links you to the report. It's a long document. I will tell you in a minute what's in it. There's a milestone report that kind of describes the entire methodology, including the different parents that went in there, how we went through versioning, how we identified the candidates, and so forth. It also describes in greater detail the logic behind the description documents, which I'll walk you through in a minute. And then for the 30 CPP candidates that I just showed you, it has the description documents and a glossary that you can have side by side. The glossary will also include things like preservation policy, and it will link out to which core preservation process links to the preservation policy as an input criteria. So I would really invite people when they look at the core preservation process descriptions to look at the glossary as well. I think it really helps understand it and put them into perspective. So what's in these documents? Let me spend a couple minutes on this. So they all follow a template. The template's also included in the Zenodo upload. Looks the same for everything. A bunch of screenshots for one single one on the left, and they're broken down into logical sections. The first thing is the descriptive section, which is the table up here and back there. And that includes inputs and outputs. Inputs and outputs can be things like data and metadata, logic like a file that comes in if you want to identify it, or you need a set of files that make up an object that you want to have descriptive metadata for, as well as outputs of the process. Then there's the definition and scope section. It helps you to understand what exactly it is. So for file format identification, for example, it will tell you what it is, what different methods exist to go through file format identification. And in scope, it tells you why it is important that you do that. And it does that for each of the 30 core preservation documents. Then it includes trigger events. Trigger events describe what happens first in order to leverage this. And then the meat is step-by-step descriptions. So it actually goes from step one, you receive the file, to the output one by one to describe what it is that you have to do. So that's a description section. There's another section which has dependencies and relationships with other CPPs. So it kind of helps you to understand what is an input process for me to leverage this, to better understand if a trigger event is a process, for example, or what comes next. And then it links to frameworks. We said earlier that those were taken as input criteria. So here it helps you as an output criteria too. So if you're actually going through Core Trust Seal certification and you're interested in, okay, I have file format identification or AIP export as process is implemented, which criteria does that link out to? And where can I use that description? This should help you understand with that for the 3 different frameworks. It also links to Premise and OAIS as 2 of the core frameworks and reference models that are used for digital preservation. And then there's a last section on reference implementations. It links to really existing example use cases that we managed to collect during the writings of the core preservation process so far, and links to publicly available documentation. As a so the publicly available documentation currently most frequently links through 3 different institutions who are partners of the project. So to my own institution, TIB, to CSC, who's another large partner in the project, and to actually Archivematica as a reference implementation, because Archivem, the software provider who's one of the project partners, is based on Archivematica. But we invite people to add their example use cases and more reference documentations. I'll tell you in the last slides how you can add yours. We're currently in the process of writing BPMN diagrams. They currently only included for one of the published CPPs, but we have furthers in the pipeline, and they will be added in the forthcoming versions. In addition to the document description, we also created a visualization tool. Screenshot of that is here. This is the short link. This is the long link. If you explore this, you can click on the bubbles and then it'll narrow down, and there's actually like a link above that will take you straight to the entire description document, so you can use that as an entry point as well. And then if you click on one thing, like let me again use the example of file format identification, that's where the different relationships and dependencies that I mentioned come into play too. So this will be a drill down into file format identification, limiting the relationship only by required by. So we can here see if we do have file format identification, what are the other processes that actually make use of the output. So you can see it creates metadata that can be used on ingest. It's used for file format validation, of course, to know which validator to route it to, but it could also be used for file migration, right, to create a file migration route. So two different sets of information, the descriptions and the visualization tools. Use the descriptions if you just want to learn more about a process, if you want to understand what it is, or if you want to understand how it links to certification processes. I would use the visualization tool more if you want to see relationships between different CPPs or extend your own workflows. So if you're just doing bitstream preservation, for example, now, and you want to extend that to other processes, you can kind of see how they can be chained together and tied together. And like I said, that it can be used as a dynamic table of contents as well, as they link to the description documents. So what's next? We want to enrich the descriptions. I already said that we want to create more BPMN diagrams and add more use case and reference implementations. We're currently in the process of creating a structured data representation. It's mainly currently you have the visualization tool and a PDF report, but we want to have structured data as well. And we're in the process of introducing semantic versioning. So we have a very solid track record of what has been updated where and when. And now, lastly, how to give feedback to Eden or to the CPPs. You can use the Eden GitHub repository. We added a repo for the CPP descriptions. The links are here. We welcome suggestions, ideas, and use cases. You can submit an issue if you have a typo or something and want to add a use case. We've also added the GitHub discussion feature and tried to structure it a little bit. So if you want to ask us questions about the CPPs or discuss with other people, you can please use this. There's two other methods for people who don't feel as comfortable using GitHub. One is just a read-only Google Doc version that you could comment to, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can anonymously use a form to just tell us that you think we're on the entirely wrong track or whatever it is that you want to tell us. And that is the end of my presentation, with a pointer to two more blogs from colleagues who were also involved in writing this, who kind of shared their experience and journey and how they feel it can be used within their countries or communities. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Mickey. We maybe take one question, I guess. Vim, you have your hand up. I was just about to say we don't have time, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick input for Mickey and colleagues. Robert Huber has started to structure the CPP information also, and I think he's unaware of the work that you have started. So somehow we need to get you together, because he's creating a SCOS repository of the terms and organization of CPP, so that we can use it as tags in the registry work in Eden. So
yeah, he's aware of it though. We told him. I mean, we told him in that email chain that I was there.
Okay. All right. So as long as you're not on divergent paths, that's perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, Vim. And we're going to obviously hear a little bit more from Vim afterwards. But in the meantime, I think in the interest of time, I will hand over to Hervé again. If you have any questions, please, or clarification questions for Mickey or for anyone else, please feel free to share them in the chat. But Hervé, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I'll try and provide a useful bridge. I know there's a lot to think about here, but as Mickey said, there is some connective tissue between these things, and I'll try and do some of that before we hand over to Vim. I'm Hervé Lors. I'm from the UK Data Archive at the UK Data Service. We're part of CESDA, and we're part of the FIDELIS project as well. The point of the FIDELIS project really is to foster harmonization and interoperability across repositories and to enable an EOSC federation of trustworthy digital repositories. We've got a version 1 out. All the feedback that we've received over time has been integrated into this piece of work. There's multiple attachments there showing what we've worked through. Honestly, if you started somewhere, I'd start at the guide, which gives you a very brief overview, but there's plenty of background in there that helps explain maybe how we've thought through how we fit in with things like TRUST and CPPs and the technical side as well. But in terms of the FIDELIS, the project is focused on types of trustworthy digital repositories, preserving digital objects, which is brilliant until you realize that all of the words in that sentence are ambiguous, disputed, or subject to debate, which is a great starting point for pulling together a network. I've got a number of slides here which you can refer back to afterwards. We've got a lot of material. We'll make sure there's additional detail, but I will flip through some of these relatively quickly. But we'll start off with objects. The FIDELIS project knows that we'll be looking at a lot of research outputs, anything which is of relevance to researchers. But the coverage is inclusive of all digital objects held by repositories, including software and code, workflows, ontologies, semantic artifacts, and metadata records held by registries. It really is anything of relevance to researchers. And we know that we've already got some confusion out in the space. I mean, Mickey's alluded to some of this about what preservation is itself. We see people referring to preservation in terms of everything from providing pretty basic storage and integrity and access services, right up to long-term actions to update disciplinary specific data and metadata to ensure digital objects remain technically usable and semantically understandable, including things like FAIR, by their expert community. So we've got to handle that broad range of definitions. And the T word in there, the initial one's trust. And we know that trust isn't binary based on what we've done so far. there's no one-size-fits-all assessment for this stuff. We're defining trustworthiness in meaningful contexts, and that depends on understanding the objects, the actors, the roles, and the expected levels of service. Yeah, and all this needs to be relied on the other T, based on reliable, transparent information. So we've got a design statement which looks at some of our reference points for all this. But probably the three highlights there are the European Commission's annotated grant agreement, which sets expectations for deliverables and outputs of funded projects and where they should go. The EOSC handbook, which provides requirements for engagement of repositories with EOSC nodes, and trust certification standards like the Core Trust Seal. So, for instance, the Core Trust Seal only applies to active preservation repositories, and as Mickey noted, the remit of FIDELIS is a bit broader. So we know that these three examples have got widely different requirements of expectations of what information should be made transparent to demonstrate trustworthiness. And then we've got things like CESDA, the ERIC Social Science Data Archives, or Elixir's work around core data resources that other organizations may need to follow as well for more discipline-specific expectations. So, as I said, trustworthiness is not a single binary outcome of a standard assessment, and we need to be flexible to adopt new variables and adjust different trust contexts over time. Looking at the repository side, the CPPs look at trustworthy digital archives, differentiated from repositories. The EOSC handbook looks at databases, though the described features look really closely aligned. The term repository can appear to exclude registries because the latter hold metadata rather than data records. In terms of breadth of scope of FIDELIS, it's probably worth thinking about this in terms of the fact that all of these and things like EOSC nodes are venues where users interact with digital objects. That term's taken from the Scientific Knowledge Graph Interoperability Framework on the OS Trails project. Basically, we've got organizations that are responsible for catalogues listing digital objects. I don't think we can get any broader than that in terms of coverage. So what we've come up with is the transparent, trustworthy repository attributes matrix, the TTRAM. It provides a structure and reference for the FIDELIS project and to a lesser extent EDEN and for this network that we're building. It uses 30 activities and functions that are relatively constant across all repositories, integrates how these are influenced by different repository variables, and how together these identify what information should be made transparent. If it's not transparent, we can't work with it at any level of cooperation. Yeah. So we need to understand the practices undertaken by the repositories and how all these things interact. And we know that in some contexts, these factors will influence trust and trustworthiness. Year 2 of the project will be looking at those contexts in a lot more detail so we can describe them in a meaningful way. The level of expectations on repositories are high. So the matrix is a tool. It's there to support us in collecting information logically and reusably, understanding the types and practice of repositories, sharing information so we can consult and use it, and in the end, designing and implementing a functional network so we can look at mutual support and aligned practice. Now, before we get to the activities and functions we've covered, some of which will look very familiar, the first variables that influence them we've selected are the levels of retention, curation, and preservation offered by the repositories, and variables around the repository users, depositors, and the objects themselves. These come from the newly released version of the Core Trust Seal. This has been in consultation for a number of years, but from a basis there of basic retention, where content is distributed as deposited, we move up through layers of deposit compliance, where data, content, and supporting metadata are checked against criteria. Some repositories deliver initial curation without a long-term remit, so they are curated by the repository to meet those defined criteria. And some offer active preservation, the remit that Mickey's been talking about in terms of those trustworthy digital archives, to make sure that responsibility is taken to make sure the data and metadata can be understood and rendered for the long term. Now, depending on which level a repository addresses, this has got different implications for each activity and function they undertake, and of course, what information they need to make transparent. So the common definitions of repositories are institutional, regional, national, generalist, disciplinary, etc. None of these are going away, but we've used these as a reference point in FIDELIS, and we know that no one of those terms tells us enough about the repository and its practices for the purposes that we need. So we need to look in more detail about the different digital object types and the content that are accepted for deposit, curation, preservation, access, etc. The range of users that are actually served, the range of depositors that are served, and how all of this influences the necessary skills and expertise within a repository. So back to those activities and functions. There's 30 of these. We've broken them down into digital object management, organizational infrastructure. Mickey mentioned those as well. We'll look at a little heat map of how these things align later. Technology and security. So this is just a superset. It's not a new thing. It's drawn from a range of existing criteria, guidelines, requirements, and standards. It's there for cooperation and alignment. And the idea is to complement and engage with those working to develop more specific and granular criteria. Yeah, it's a mapping onto them. It's a table of contents. It's not intended to dilute or replace them. But we started off with these 13. There's plenty of things to look at out there in the world when you're trying to work out what you're expected to do as a repository. And within the repository boundary, we've got these groups and each activity and function, external actors, and a life cycle flow. So across these at a very basic level, we've got security and then technical infrastructure, both of which have got their own very mature existing criteria around them. We've put storage and integrity under technology, they're closely related to the CPP work. We've got a number of organizational infrastructure measures to ensure that the rest of this works. And then we've got the digital object management piece with a fairly familiar life cycle of transfer from original curation through to the reuse phase. And they come together like this. It's not a small list, but we feel it's a manageable list in terms of being a design compromise to support a range of repositories and be very inclusive across the network. So at the basic level, we take each one of these, we give them an identifier within the group, we give them a title, and we create a very narrow, specific description, which is not intended to get any larger or more complicated as time goes on, because there are plenty of other people doing things which map into this. On the left there, you'll see the transparent information. These are an evolving list based on what different people want. But as Dare said at the beginning, a lot of these things don't say what they want in any specific way. They make general statements about desirability, but not specific statements about the minimum viable or ideal information that should be provided. And as we've said, we're noting how each of these are impacted by these two initial variables, the levels of retention, curation, and preservation, and these repository, depositor, user, and object characteristics. So we're starting to build up a list which allows us to more granularly understand an individual repository and what it does. Some of them are not applicable, as you'll see from here. And we provide a blank template for this as well if people want to use it. But we very explicitly want to point out that this is not a membership form for a future network or a test. There are no wrong answers. It's not a quiz. It's just a series of things which allow us to jump off into other information. So talking about jumping off into other information, looking at the core preservation processes, we're talking about moving from the general to the more specific and granular. That's a slightly different thing from what we've done to build the initial list, because a lot of those are kind of a similar level to the core trust seal, a little bit higher. We're looking at how this can deliver not only planning, but also implementation across the life cycle. So we need to think about that sort of thing. So there's not going to be a perfect map, but we know there are a number of different perspectives on preservation. And something that's been discussed with Mickey and with the EOSC Long-Term Retention Task Force is how we pull this together into an integrated view of preservation planning, which any repository could deploy and share in a coherent way, not for judgment, but just for transparency and comparison. You'll recognize this diagram from the work that Mickey's presented just previously. And here, these aren't the latest versions of the CPPs. These were all mapped out during the drafting phase. They'll be updated now. We've got two version 1s out the door. But this shows how these things map into the life cycle view. A range of these map into the current definition of preservation, but our numbers, if you see that little thing on the side there, map into storage integrity under security. But what this allows us to do in terms of this kind of high level mapping is to create, across what allows us to create a bit of a heat map. Now, this isn't a pass or fail or a judgment on the mapping between two of these things. It gives you an idea of coverage when you map these down, yeah? So orange there, yeah, there's something of a variation between the two, or something of an alignment between the two. Green shows a very strong alignment between the two sets of criteria. And those red things show things that aren't necessarily supported in the CPPs. Now, given the scope of work that Mickey has stated in the beginning, that's exactly what we'd expect. Yeah. We know, and we've explicitly said, that those organizational infrastructure measures aren't necessarily a focus of the CPPs. And it's doing this kind of crosswalk and alignment and using these things as stepping stones for one set of criteria to the next that we think will help a lot of repositories in their network start to navigate this really quite complex space. So we know that most activities and functions will not be broadly applicable, but if you provide retention, storage, and access, but you don't curate or preserve objects, maybe some of them won't, but everything else will. And I'll reiterate again that the matrix is not a form to be completed, an assessment or a test. There are no wrong answers, there are no judgments. This is just a tool for us to think at a high level how we spread out and start to integrate information from the wider community. So we've got multiple points of alignment with network and governance and training support, cascading grants and communication across the various projects on Fidelis. And within Eden, we've got those ones there, some of which you've already heard of, but also the long-term access and preservation services and tools on Work Package 2, which is led by Wim, who you're about to hear from, and also the RDA work on technical repository service providers, which is his specific focus for today. So hopefully that'll lead in nicely. But overall, we know that the outputs on preservation, reappraisal, and quality criteria can be integrated into the matrix as they come along, specifically around active long-term preservation repositories and disciplinary repositories and technical services. We want to be able to drill down into those differences. Yeah. We know that these outputs will be broadly applicable well beyond the relationship between Fidelis and Eden. We're testing these out as we go along. So essentially, the matrix will also support ongoing alignment with existing standards, guidelines, criteria, and metadata. That's not just crosswalks. That's talking to people, asking what their expectations were, and getting them to provide something more specific about what they expect, benefit to us all, and then examination of additional variables that influence transparency, including the TRUST principles. So hopefully some of that helps to bring together how we're looking down and trying to integrate some of the work that you're seeing across the board today. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hervé. That was a very good overview of what the TRAM, the Fidelis project, and also just bring together some of those ideas that we've been covering so far and that will be covered by Wim next. Wim, in the interest of time, I will not ask for any clarifying questions. I will hand over to you if you want to share your own screen, share your slides.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, let me do that.
And just while you're getting that set up, again, just to reiterate, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. Wim, as I said, we have kind of about 15 minutes per presentation. If you want to cut a few minutes off that to make some more time for questions and discussion at the end, that would be great.
I'll do my best. Okay, so today I'm presenting the work being done by the Trustworthy Technical Repository Service Providers Working Group, which I concur was an unfortunate jumble of terms that had to be shortened to the TRSPs Working Group. So the working group is co-chaired by myself, by Alison Lister, Lauren Maxwell, and Mohan Ramamurthy. And we've had excellent support from Ryan and from Lisa Letsalu from Tiger. And yeah, it's a pity that it cannot continue. I think that's a sentiment shared by many of us. The rationale for the working group, as we try to explain it, apart from the fact that we want to understand what the criteria might be for certification of service providers to repositories in the broad sense, and potentially software platforms that these repositories might be using, is also to think about the broadening of the umbrella of trust. And very briefly, we've looked at this since the start of the working group about 15 months ago or so. Certified repositories number, I would guess, still not more than about 200 globally. That's an order of magnitude lower than the number of repositories that you can find in common registries such as We3Data and others, and potentially another order of magnitude lower than the actual repositories, especially if you think about institutional repositories at the universities globally. So there's clearly a need to try and inform the public a little bit better about the characteristics, potentially the performance, the costs and other factors that might influence their selection, even if those repositories are not certified in one way or another. So we kept this in the back of our minds when we started work in the working group. Lauren has added some ammunition to this by citing a paper that she was involved in, where when looking at, let's say, COVID-19 participant level biomedical data, that about only 2 out of 400 repositories that they identified as sources were certified. So that's clearly a drop in the ocean. Okay, but the work group had as these objectives to conduct a landscape review of existing certification schemes and trust frameworks, incorporating outputs such as code and semantic artifacts also, with a view to identifying the characteristics and features of repositories that might be in scope for service providers and software platforms. And that has broadened quite considerably beyond the original objective. And I'll explain what we looked at just in a few slides from now. But also to try and establish modular features and characteristics of repositories that are based on community expectations. So what are the things that the community would be interested in knowing or evaluating or assessing about a repository or a service provider? And then which of these functions could be delegated to a service provider or a software platform to improve efficiency and scalability? What we mean by that is that there is at least a theoretical case for certification of certain characteristics or features of a service that could be passed on to users of those services without the need of subsequent certification. And then also to develop alternatives to formal or binary certification, such as self-assessments with evidence as an example. So fairly broad scope of work that we embarked on, but we're slowly tying up all of these towards the end of the working group's life cycle. Okay, so the landscape analysis, as I said, became quite a bit broader because participants in the working group started contributing sources of characteristics and features that they thought would be of use or of interest. And when I say characteristics of features, we should again see this in a broad sense, because in TRAM and FIDELIS work, they talk about activities and functions and processes, but ultimately we're interested in anything that could indicate to an end user, or for that matter, some assessment process, what the level of performance or type of process or type of approach is that a repository might follow for a specific characteristic. And this is a very broad church. It includes things like cost, constraints on file sizes, if we're talking about very practical matters that almost never feature in formal certification, all the way to the aspects that are being considered through Core Seal or Nestor or others, for example. So there is some information about the scope of work that we took on in our landscape analysis. On the far left, you'll see that there's quite a few of these that we have not yet evaluated and are unlikely to get around to. But there's diminishing returns in adding yet additional landscape analysis sources, because we have probably identified 80 or 90% of the characteristics that are important, and looking wider would not necessarily identify significant additional content. So we've arranged our landscape analysis and the characteristics and features that we identify broadly along the trust principles, with cost added as one of the features. But it's worth understanding that any of these sources, whether it's CPP or FAIR principles or CARE or core trust seal or any other source, serves effectively two purposes. In one case, they supply us with a list of additional characteristics and features or attributes or services that we should consider adding to our inventory of characteristics and features, but they also often provide an organizing principle. So CPP, for instance, can be used to identify or map to attributes that might include the presence of a process or evidence that such a process is being followed. But CPP also organizes the fact that you have such a process into a context that links into one of the CPPs. And the same is true for TTRAM, the same is true for core trust seal, and for many others. So from these sources, we get a mixture of identification of characteristics and features, but we also get information about how they would organize these characteristics and features from their perspective. So we have to accommodate both of these. So our mapping that we are composing in the TRSP and are now integrating with EDEN outputs such as the CPPs, and also intend to map onto the FIDELIS TTRAM. We take into account that a characteristic or a feature could be tagged with an origin or a source. In other words, it's mentioned by CPP or core trust seal or whatever, but that there is also an organization hierarchy or graph that we might want to take note of and record in one way or another, that serves as a way to see characteristics through the lens of one of these landscape sources. So it sounds potentially quite complicated, but I think we've made good progress to encode all of the different links to the sources in the TRSP. And of course, informally, this serves as a mapping between different sources. So via the shared characteristics and features, it's possible to figure out that, for argument's sake, that characteristic or feature is mentioned in CPP and in core trust seal and in 2 or 3 or however many other sources. So informally, it's already a sort of a mapping between all of these different sources. So the status is that we've completed our landscape analysis, more or less. We're working on a conceptual model that I'll say a little bit about quickly. And then we have results of what now amounts to 4 community consultations that we will report on shortly to our participants and the wider community. So we have identified out of these characteristics and features, 29 of them that the community indicates are important for understanding services to repositories in the broad sense. 12 of them that are applicable to software platforms such as Invenio or CCAN or Dataverse and similar. And then there, quite importantly, about 11 of these characteristics spread between services and software platforms that participants felt could be inherited in cases of appraisal or certification by the repository that is going through that process. So we'll package this. Our intention is to share it with major stakeholders, Nestor, CTS, the World Data System, and others, to get their feedback on these initial results from the community consultation. And those inputs will then help us to finalize the outputs from the working group. There's a strong overlap, but just to finalize in terms of the characteristics and features and their mappings with the work that's happening in EDEN Work Package 2, We are not discussing that in much detail today, but together with inputs from CPP, from TTRAN, and so on, we are busy creating, in effect, in the background, an inventory of all the attributes that we could identify. They may be evidence that a process is in place. It may be the result of some service being executed, such as fair assessment and so on. All of these go into an inventory, and then we are linking them back to what we call profiles, which could come from an authority such as CTS. It could be the view from a domain on which characteristics are important, a network or initiative such as FIDELIS, and so on. So the tagging and organizing principles of these attributes and characteristics will be maintained in the EDEN inventory, and the outputs of that is likely to be available then towards March 2026, because at that time EDEN has to publish their first attempt at a registry, which should cover the scope of the FIDELIS registries and mapped onto the attributes that they actually offer as part of characterization of those repositories. Okay, so that's the story. Happy to answer questions, of course.
Great. Thank you, Wim. Thank you. Almost exactly 15 minutes per. That's ideal. Yeah, so I guess at this stage we do have about 15 minutes free for discussion. Does anyone have any questions either for Wim or for any of the other presenters so far, either on the working groups activities themselves or the projects, or even just kind of questions for the group on how these various activities sort of interlink? Just quickly check on the chat. Lauren, please go ahead.
It would be interesting for those of us who are not involved in FIDELIS and EDEN to hear more just about how those two groups are working with one another, and then how what the ultimate objectives are and what kind of the vision is going forward. And just given that these groups, it seems that their funding is going to 2027, what you see as kind of next steps, or again, where you're trying to go with the work that you're doing, which is fantastic. Thanks.
So, Hervé and Mickey, I invite you to answer.
I'm going to leave the vision part to Hervé. But on an operational level, I can say that I mean there's a fair overlap in project participants across the two, for especially the work that Hervé is presenting around the TTRAM and the core preservation process. We have regular meetings to kind of just cross-check where we're at and make sure that we're on the same trajectory. And there's also a shared project management board meeting between the two projects to ensure that the overall strategy of the two projects align. So they're really closely following each other in those regards.
Yeah. The funding and the focus is European. So in terms of membership, they've got a bit of a challenge, of course, because the problems are noticeably global for anyone paying attention. So I think that's one of the early efforts at the moment is they're talking about what their membership models and what their engagement will look like from a European perspective, and that will be an internal discussion with things like the European Open Science Cloud and the European Commission's expectations. As I said, obviously there's a huge number of repositories directly impacted by those expectations in Europe. But I do know that absolutely everybody in the project also understands that none of these problems are national or regional, and none of these solutions is going to get delivered by some sort of weird geographical subset of the world in absence of cooperation with the rest of them. So that's what I'll say underneath that. Hopefully the stuff that I was saying sounded extremely inclusive, yeah, because I think it has to be. And I think one of the points of granularity here, one of the things that we're starting to get the details from out of the stuff that the work that Wim's described, is that there's lots of fairly high level hand wavy expectations of what all these repositories should be delivering. And we all know what we mean by preservation, and we all know what we mean by trust, and we all know what we mean by quality, etc., etc. But we don't. And like at the moment, we're in the situation where lots of different repositories are desperately struggling with those issues with very few resources individually. And we'd like that to happen less. Yeah. And we'd like that to happen less by enabling a few conversations and getting a bit more specific about things. Yeah. So the membership model is evolving. There's already meetings. People can join the EDEN FIDELIS communication stuff to follow that directly. So that's all completely inclusive as well. And then from the project cooperation point of view, what's great for me at the moment is the fact that we started off by saying, here's a bunch of stuff at a similar level, which we're comparing. Yeah. The CPPs give us a test piece of going down to something that's more granular and has got a narrower scope. And I think if we can make that work and communicate that well, I think certainly my exemplar at the moment is I know that my repository and the repositories of Eric's like CESDA would really benefit from having that kind of view on the space. And I think that can be improved by the network, but it's got value independent of the network, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wait, please go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So I think EDEN FIDELIS also has a kind of unique value because you talk with a lot of repositories, a lot of our different operations. And so far, I think the discussion from the presentation is really focused on the characteristics of individual repositories. And I wonder if that you guys also have some sense that what other features or functions are common across the repositories. So then maybe some investment can be in actually how to build like a common infrastructure, and then each repository will focus on the specialty of theirs. So then it may make the whole system, the like repository ecosystem more sustainable, efficient. I mean, that's just kind of thought. I don't know if you guys have, think about that.
Yeah, I think that we focus too much on disciplines and not enough on methodologies and content types. Yeah, because there's the similarities between multiple disciplines are actually more about like research methodologies and about content types. So we could do with drilling down to those. Despite the fact that disciplinary and cross-disciplinary research is vital, it quite often depends on understanding the methodologies and the content types. And I think, Dara, you raised a great point, which is that we're more similar than we are different in many, many ways. So the trick is to get to the point that we understand how we're different and we don't worry about it. And then we get the right groups of people who are similar into the right place to have the conversations about why they're similar. Yeah. And I think if we can deliver some of that, that will be a massive benefit to getting the right people in the right rooms to clarify some of these points.
Wim, please go ahead.
Yeah, just also in response to Dawei quickly. So in EDEN Work Package 2, we are building links between services and repositories. Because I mean, it's obviously fuzzy if you look from the outside, because a repository can also be considered to be a service and so on and so on. But broadly speaking, we are building links to say repository A is providing these services, and here are the evidence and the endpoints and so on and so on. Or they are consuming services. They might be using a file transformation service or a metadata crosswalk service and so on. So it should, at least in theory, be possible in future to say which repositories are using this service, and isn't there some benefit to harmonizing the way in which they implement these services? So that kind of benefit, I think, could also come from the EDEN and FIDELIS work. But I also have a quick practical question. We don't have to resolve it today, but just so that Mickey, Hervé, and others that are involved in these efforts are aware of it. So we continually, of course, have the situation in the EDEN project and in the TRSP efforts. We would identify a characteristic or a feature or an attribute, whatever we want to call it eventually, that says, for argument's sake, we need to understand the level of curation. And we anticipate that there might be standard values that can be selected or offered by a repository to indicate their level of curation. And FIDELIS has started defining some of these through LoreCap. But the point I guess I want to make is that there are many of these sets of almost like controlled vocabulary lists that demonstrate a level of performance or an implementation option. For argument's sake, what kind of business model do you get your income from, and so on. And we need a mechanism to start recording these vocabularies, even if they might not be finalized on some kind of a consensus basis. So that's just a heads up to say that the lookup values or the possible values for some of these attributes and characteristics, we anticipate that they are there, but we are not the curators of what they should be. And we're looking to potentially FIDELIS and the other work packages in EDEN to assist with that.
I'd like to just invite, thanks for that, Vim, and thanks for everybody so far. I mean, I'd like to invite anybody who wasn't sort of involved in the presentation so far, if there is any questions from anyone there. Again, just feel free to even unmute your microphone, or please feel free to type your question into the chat. Paul, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting sort of webinar. So with all the presentations, this is very interesting material. But for me, I'm a little bit of a fish out of water here. So this is something that's a lot of information to take in. So that's very, very good. Perhaps if I can, I'm curious how much where I'm coming from matches the projects and what their goals are there, because this is for me, whenever you're attending these things, it's trying to find a correlation or a match where it fits. So I'm working in an organization called DAISY, which is photon facility. One of the things is a photon facility, which is a part of a network of 16 facilities in Europe called LEAPS. And this, to give you a kind of an idea, this is a facility where people come with materials. They want to do characterization. This might be biological, it might be structural, it might be any kind of things for research purposes. We take data, analyzing it. To give you a kind of a feel for this, we're currently taking, let's say, on a busy weekend, we might be taking a petabyte of data. We're ramping up now in the next few years. That's at DAISY alone, probably multi-petabyte data per day on busy days. That data, we can't preserve all of it, but we want to preserve scientifically relevant aspects of that going forward. So there's various challenges that come in there. The facilities until recently were generally geared towards people taking data away with them. With the large amounts of data, this is no longer practical. So there's a certain shift in the community now. So I mentioned there's sort of 16 facilities spread throughout Europe that are in sort of similar positions. We're starting, there's a movement in the community towards things like Core Trust Seal. So we have one facility that has now adopted or been certified under Core Trust Seal. But this is very much a beginning of a journey, at least from my perspective, beginning of the journey for this community of these large X-ray facilities and neutron facilities to some extent as well, although their data volumes are of a lower capacity, I would say. So I think for us in our situation, we kind of we suffered the same problems I think everyone has in terms of lack of funding to actually pursue all the things we might want to do in the direction of data preservation and curation. But one of the problems that comes from that is perhaps the ability to get up to speed with the current state of the art and what all of these projects are doing. And so whilst this webinar is great for providing some of this information, there's a whole lot of information here that I'm personally, and I think for people in my community as well, seeing for the first time. So having some kind of on-ramp or mechanism whereby people can get up to speed with all of this terminology, the ideas and concepts, these kinds of things, I think would be a very helpful addition. So I'm not sure what form that would take, but just as a sort of immediate feedback, some way in which this kind of material could be broken down and sort of put into a format that's people who are not in this field day in day out can get up to speed on it. I think that would be a very helpful thing, just as some immediate feedback there.
Thank you, Paul. That's really interesting to hear from your perspective on the kind of service provider perspective. Hervé, please go ahead.
We're all different and we are all the same, so you're absolutely right. Join the EDEN FIDELIS network thing, because that's exactly the kind of example we're looking for. Yeah, how do we bring someone from the beginning with a high level area of interest and drill them down to where they need to be? Yeah, and we're acutely aware of the fact that at the same time we're trying to work out how to do that, we're also generating yet more content because everyone is asking for it. So that's a really good point. We bring them together. The only other thing I'll say is that I did a thing ages ago. CERN throws away more data every second than my organization's connected since 1967, but we retain a number of similarities. So, you know, these things are not immutable.
Thank you, Hervé. Does anyone else want to come in on that from the project's perspective, Vim or Mickey, before we wrap up and we're kind of reach the top of the session, but we still have a few more minutes.
No, just really, I mean, when we wrote the core preservation process, we included things like scope and description exactly for that reason, to make sure that we could get people on board and understand why this is important. And we see a lot of room there to base training materials on this. So I think that's one of the outcomes, or like a possible output or a follow-up action of what we're doing here. And like Hervé said, the network is supposed to be exactly for that. One of the objectives of the EDEN project is to close the knowledge gap around curation and preservation across different disciplines. So we do keep that in mind when writing these documents. And it would be great to hear feedback on them.
Yeah, maybe just an additional note that in let's say describing repositories through their characteristics and features, we retain annotations to the sources of those characteristics and features and attributes and so on. And these are often best practice like references. So that kind of information, I think we should endeavor to keep available for end users to find. You know, if someone is talking about level of curation, just as an example, or one of the core preservation processes, that it's possible to find any linked practices or standards or specifications that are associated with that topic.
Yeah, maybe I would just a quick add. I think for Paul's challenges, I think is very common for biomedical field as well. So like people want to focus on the generation of data first, but then take care of the preservation or curation later. That's often kind of costly at the later stage. I think it would be good thinking early, like, you know, the high level issues, like say, you know, data governance, who owns data, what is your users, and those are kind of the trust principle, kind of trying to lay out, say, you know, consider this high level things first, and then if you need it, and go to different implementations like certification standard or other best practices.
Thank you, Dawa. Thanks, Vim. We have reached the top of the session now. Half past the hour. I think we'll just maybe wrap up. There's one or two things quickly I will want to share on my screen. Apologies. There we go. I'll share my Firefox, I guess. There's a link, question from two questions from Lauren in the slides, in the chat, which we won't get a chance to get to, unfortunately. But I just think that shows something. I guess it's trying to link back to the very start of the webinar and the kind of the motivation for us from the Tiger perspective to host this was there's obviously a lot of personnel even overlap between these different initiatives and projects and groups, but then I think it's getting people together in the right room is of value. Hervé has linked mentioned a webinar from FIDELIS from next week. I think there's a link in there, so I invite people to register to join that. Just on a slightly different topic, we do have I mentioned earlier on that the Tiger project has developed this knowledge base. So for those of you who are involved in RDA working groups, I think this will be something that will be absolutely of relevance to you. It's a new feature for the community. It's going to be very important, I think, moving on beyond the end of the Tiger project. 2 webinars next week on just kind of like a very much a hands-on how to use this new tool. Please register there. There's two sessions on next Thursday. What else was I going to say? Yeah, so basically, thank you. This is really interesting. I think this is really the point of what we wanted to do with this series, is to kind of bring people who are working on similar, related, not related issues together, and just start these discussions. Also, I mean, there is these, for those of you who aren't familiar with RDA, perhaps you're not members of groups or whatever, these groups, the presentations that kind of bookended the discussion today, from the presentation from Vim and from Dawe. Those 2 working groups are still active. It's free to join. It's free to become an RDA member. And you're absolutely welcome to join these groups. I know the TRSPs group has a next working group meeting next Wednesday afternoon. And please feel free, if you find that, go to the slides and you'll be able to find the link to the group. Sign up to your RDA or sign in if you're already a member and just join that group. And please feel free to join us at the next meeting next week. And I'm sure that the trust group will have another meeting maybe before Christmas, possibly just after. But yeah, just thank you again before we wrap up to all the presenters so far. I think hopefully this will be the start of kind of further collaboration. I know there's already stuff planned, but I hope this is kind of practical kickoff to that. And thank my other colleagues on the Tiger project as well, Lisa, who was here, and Alexandra, Philomen, and others who were involved in the series already. With that, I will wrap up. And thanks a lot all for joining again. And yeah, hope to see you all, some faces in working group meetings again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great stuff. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lauren. That was great.